The Biopsychosocial States of America. What might unite it, Christianism or scientism? The Free Speech Essays 1 through 3 of the 2022 report, by Henry J. Winters. Preface. America's brutal past is making a resurgence, pushing Christian ideologies as the law of the land. It's doubtful most Bible advocates would know what that entails, but the well-read science-literate segment of the population is all too aware of its potential meaning. Recklessly, several religious groups are determined to redefine the idea of God and country from its early racist beginnings. Unsatisfied with the natural progress of man, these ideologues are reconstituting America's early history to contradict science. As a result, our country is not presently operating in accordance with the majority's will. The obstructionist's agenda and Republican power grab are undoubtedly assisted by a church-led, corporate-driven alliance. As part of America's urgent need for a holistic government reform, abolishing the filibuster is only the first of many necessary steps to secure our democracy for the ages. The inequity within any people resides in those promoting the favorable parts of their country's past while downplaying the various tragedies committed by its religions. These biases undermine a standardized public education with separatist narratives, taught in government-subsidized religious schools and the church's private for-profit universities and colleges. These altered Christian interpretations of knowledge are duplicitous and far from being academic. Moreover, the religious stories of old can become so schooled in the people's thinking that it facilitates a disconnect between those who continually improve their education and those who have permitted archaic doctrines to impede their intellectual growth and, in several cases, their emotional stability. Nowadays, there's no need to ponder a God residing in another dimension of time and space that we can't access. We must focus on this one life that almost certainly came about through natural causes. If we thought our destiny was in our own hands, we would be increasingly motivated to protect our best interests for the near and distant future. But any substantial planning to improve our long-term survivability here on Earth appears to be taking a back seat to Christian fanaticism and the excessive greed of its corporate moguls lurking behind the scenes. Saving money is compatible with making money. So, to actualize bigger savings, corporate America must collaborate and learn from the church how to secure favorable government subsidies and to ensure they can remain as tax-free as possible. I've been a moderate participant in Christianity for most of my life, but now fully support the scientific method. Because materialism better explains more of our world than a supernatural religion possibly could, I will continue to dissect the Bible's claims through empiricism, regardless of any lack of humility or reactionary pushback from the indignant Christian advocates. My rejection of a celestial overseer will stand by the null hypothesis until substantial evidence for an all-powerful metabeing is falsifiable, and until one of its metaphysical philosophies is accurately and unequivocally confirmed, which has not yet happened. As for the push toward Christian nationalism, I have one cautionary response. Read The Prince, by Niccolò Machiavelli, written in 1513, and then be careful what you wish for. Section 1. Introduction. Silence is the virtue of fools. Francis Bacon. He lived from 1561 to 1626, during the early age of science. Voltaire spoke, "Judge a man by his questions rather than by his answers." He lived following Sir Francis Bacon from 1694 to 1778 during the Age of Enlightenment. François-Marie Diderot, known by his pseudonym Voltaire, wrote prolifically in support of church-state separation, freedom of speech, and toleration of religious liberty, but sharply criticized the Roman Catholic Church. Peruse the free online Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. From early Western Enlightenment examples, America's 1788 framers of the U.S. Constitution, who consisted of a substantial number of individualistic thinkers, knew the potential dangers church-directed rule would have on a free people and their government. But the earlier divide between the deistic founding fathers and the church-styled religious institutions' desire for dominance over secularism is still widespread, as well as the rejection of our evolutionary origins by the Neo-Darwinian synthesis and the Human Genome Project, respectively. The rejection of scientific evidence, in general, is due to the unwelcomed corrections it has made to the Bible's geological and biological claims. However, thanks to the ease of Internet searches, some progress is being made to debunk supernatural dogmas further. A 2021 University of Michigan study showed that evolution, as a fact of nature, is now accepted by 52% of Americans. Consider this 3-section essay, my supplementary treatise on Christianism and Scientism, and where either one of these oft-pejorative terms might lead us. Those of a practical mind state looking to exercise legitimate methods of inquiry, through higher education and standard forms of logic, will find my sequel of essays insightful. For others, it will be an outrageous affront to their faith. Despite this essay's potential offensive content, and through our better tameable nature, this article will attempt to guide those to a new awareness of the Christian religion's ideas of truth, with a capital T, and the more critical truth known through the processes of science. I will, in future essays, endeavor to present an expanded look into a knowable reality and explore the objectionable content I've found in the Bible scriptures. We are products of our past. Like you, my knowledge accumulated from life experiences. The memories and inferences from those personal events become integral to our belief system. Most want to know the difference between fact and fiction to help inform and guide their lives. Unfortunately for many youngsters, incorrect beliefs are instilled in a child's mind before they can think for themselves. After this initial learning stage, our hopes, dreams, and biological functions take on a life of their own until new evidence amends the bulk of our mistaken beliefs, conquers irrational fears, overcomes life's adversities, starts to hone our character, and inspires us in the realm of nature's reality. In a best-case scenario, this combination of experience and intellect transforms the core of our worldviews, or the imprinting of fundamental religious knowledge becomes a peculiarly haunting yet alluring lifelong proposition. Like most others, the mind has naturally evolved to detect patterns that help us predict future events when our selective short attention span is not working against us. My beliefs and social experiences inform my decisions until logically confirmed or corrected. But one's personal education and ideas are of questionable value if not openly shared and scrutinized. Embarrassed and disturbed by the current state of America, I asked, what harm can come from uncritical thinking? This curiosity intensified my ongoing inquisition into the church-styled religion and its lesser-studied adverse effects it has on our learning and decision-making processes. We are much more alike than different, except for our varying levels of critical thinking skills, early influences, random genetic predispositions, and some medical disorders. We don't all do our best to adapt or prepare for a prolonged life on Earth with its harsh realities. That is to say, a future with no coming of a loving Savior God. Has this, so far as we can tell, been the case for over 30 human generations? In all of man's marvels, he is proven to be much better at fixing problems than he ever has been at preventing them. With this truism in mind, it should give us a little hope and pause to reflect on our shortcomings, revisit our old values of repose, and help us devote more time to progressive subjects of existential importance. Of course, adjusting the mindset of a substantial portion of the population, stuck in their old ways, will encounter much resistance. But a better understanding of truth, with a lowercase t, based on discoveries and sound evidence is a necessary part of life if we aim to improve it. Our minds should focus on tangible objectives and their natural outcomes, the things we can have control over, not on hopes and wishes from which inaction produces no human utility or predictive value. I care about the human condition and want to uncover what contributes to culturally oriented dysfunctions manifest through misinformation and unfounded beliefs. Becoming a rational person is an honorable achievement that requires a thorough exploration on both sides of the big divide, often involving objective factors that tend to clash with traditional anecdotes. As a highly evolved primate species, the supernatural guesswork of any mystical proportion falls short of a consistent qualitative or quantifiable benefit in this technological turning point of our civilization. It's generally wise to start believing something after relevant evidence supporting a claim is extant, and then tentatively adopt the most realistic conclusions unadulterated by one's emotional appeals. As challenging as this may be, the overarching goal is to sufficiently explain the pros and cons of truth with a capital T and the standard definition of truth with the lowercase t. I'll get right to my point. Logic and reason are under attack by the Christian Church collective and their believers' tenuous ideologies. As an evolving hominid species, we could unify more of our world's population by dispelling its ancient myths and ensuring that present-day schools teach higher levels of inductive and deductive critical thinking skills. If we cared to save America and work on a calming wave of peace, we need to discourage the factions working to sabotage that effort. Most don't know or acknowledge that Christians worship the Abrahamic God, called Yahweh, and his Savior, Jesus, and the Muslims worship the same Abrahamic God but call him Allah and his one and only true Prophet Muhammad. And the Jews are still waiting for that same Abrahamic God's true Savior to make his debut. Excluding the Baha'i faiths, I think of these three Abrahamic factions as a believable trinity. But any wise futuristic thinking must not be afraid to challenge the status quo and pursue a science curriculum that the larger population can recognize and support with a higher level of understanding. We need not ever base our hopes and dreams on unfounded expectations and ad hoc explanations of a supernatural divinity pulling the strings of our fate. But it will be essential to set up a sound educational base, devoted to practical human discourse, to assess what gains and losses have come from Christianism and scientism. Never should there be a contest between church and state interests. Our unguided evolutionary roots are a well-established fact, whether you accept it or not. The story of Adam and Eve proves one primary thing: man's experiences with life often require ample time and thoughtful guidance to mature in a larger population. Humanity has arrived at this crossroads, partly because we can alter natural selection through artificial interventions and drastically change our world's environment for the good, the bad, or even the ugly outcome. On a micro level, there is lots of blame to go around, but the principles of decency remain constant throughout time. Unfortunately, many good health outcomes face opposition from the stubborn, often unethical establishment and its backward and sometimes profitable allure. However, reliance on old and often deleterious practices may always be with us. The benefits of knowledge and progress on the human condition are only as good as the willingness to change and make the necessary sacrifices to modernize. Failure to plan and act on behalf of those yet born are crimes against future humanity, any way you assess it. To make thoughtfulness a standard modus operandi will entail supporting a well-educated public that agrees to a self-determined purpose for humankind. The guidelines of the veil of ignorance proposed by John Rawls would assist in unifying progress to this end. What would be so hard about changing our outlook today to foster a better tomorrow for all? Could religious ideas of human defeatism or man's untamed behaviors keep us from a self-determined lot here on earth? Since science cannot be stopped but only slowed, we have no choice but to accept and manage it cautiously and thoroughly if we don't want the world's children to bear the burdens of past mistakes that reflect unthoughtful actions or worse, are soundly thoughtful inactions. An excellent example to consider regarding man's morals and where it all starts can be summarized in the following statement. Black and white kids are blind to racial bigotry until their family members, or their society teaches it to them. The same applies to traditionally handed down religious beliefs of the supernatural, especially those ethical, moral, and political issues said to be God's domain. But truth proclamations from the Church are not demonstrable, and to question the existence of their divine overlord puts you in league with their devil. However, it must be known that those people who participate in a cultural delusion, knowingly or unknowingly, and become intolerant and contemptuous as a result, are unsuitable guardians of children and ultimately the perpetrators of civil unrest, if they don't change their outlook. I have concluded that waiting and wishing in the empty halo of faith is not an effective practice for humankind. Believing in an alternative reality is a built-in part of most religions, similar to the common denial of addictions or the general lack of correct knowledge. It's like a fanciful veil that conceals the natural world and the harmful effects of Christianity generated and maintained through indoctrination and selfish acts of the ego gone astray. While presenting my case, I'll have the unenviable task of keeping the reluctant or intolerant reader curious and, to some extent, unoffended. Because these religious sensitivities are so prevalent in the population, it's doubtful the average spiritual stalwart will give my charges a fair appraisal due to their uncritical presuppositions and reactionary posturing. But regardless of someone's lack of knowledge, or disinterest, in the facts of science and benefits of reason, I feel compelled to step up to my plinth of education and openly question the negative religious issues that so many are afraid or unwilling to challenge. But more importantly, these essays will unmask an array of problematic Bible scriptures for those justly questioning their God beliefs. It should also help comfort those transitioning from being non-affiliated with a church or remaining agnostic to becoming an outed atheist engaged in more generic humanistic causes outside the church's mandates. Atheism is not evil in and of itself. It is mutually inclusive and does not blatantly divide large groups of people as religions do. The importance of pure humanism is unrivaled by any religious practices that have repeatedly divided cultures and countries worldwide. A philosophical groundwork identifies the two fundamentally divergent perspectives that act as the centerpiece of our worldviews. One side of this outlook is creationism. It is a metaphysical philosophy that, in its theological perspective, believes that a transcendent non-biological form of consciousness predates the material universe and purposefully created life, which I refer to as the meta-entity hypothesis. Creationism is a top-down, emotionally conceptualized insistence, through a personal conviction, that an undetectable God spoke life into existence. From that point forward, there was no place to go but downhill into the depths of persecution and destruction. In contrast to this metaphysical aspect of the non-corporeal is philosophical naturalism or materialism, not to be confused with greed or evil. It declares that matter, also called mass, is the only reality by which any complex order can arise. Materialism is a bottom-up concept that also asserts, through fact-based inferences, that energy and mass emerged from non-conscious random quantum effects and proton gradients. Complexity then arose within small pockets of low-level entropy in a thermodynamic open system, leading to life and its ongoing development. I describe the universe with no God as the emergent properties hypothesis. In a practical scenario, man is solely responsible for his self-improvement and his interactions with the environment, assuming he has a reasonably good start in life. These key philosophical isms greatly divide our planet's human population. Conspicuously, only one of these concepts can be the correct perspective that accurately informs our understanding of reality. They cannot both be true. Therefore, it's everybody's business to discover, as best they can, which concept is most valid, for our sake and that of others. To help defend any belief, we should always be prepared to answer for our position. Be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you, a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear. 1 Peter 3 verse 15. The three standard principles of logic used to guide our reasoning are the law of identity, non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. These laws, called the informal principles of logic, are the most straightforward foundations of reasoning. Those principled guidelines adhere to a standard format that all agents must recognize and agree to follow in critical arguments or formal debates. In the above philosophical scenario of a God or no God, we're invoking the third law, that of the excluded middle. This law concludes there is only one possible outcome, whether something is or isn't. We can rationally express our thoughts while constructing valid and sound conclusions to our questions, if seeking truth with the lowercase t is our lifelong objective, versus the Church's kind of capitalized truth issued by fiat, and that's the end of the story. My contributions to reason, cautious skepticism, and rational free thought are nothing new among the women and men who have engaged these issues, currently and throughout history. But like those others, I try to carefully argue that secular wisdom is necessary when one's health, security, and the sustainability of more significant long-term world concerns are at stake. So, to move towards a more peaceful environment for our children to grow up in and feel safe, the information herein is essential for our nation to assess and debate thoroughly. Or, if for no other reason than to recognize our best summation of a sound truth, what religions consider are facts compared to the basic organic information derived through science. Section 2. The unexamined life is a life not worth living. Socrates. Consider the following analogy. Calming the sea of troubled waters starts with blocking the prevailing winds responsible for the storm. Say the surge of wind currents is not understood to be the primary cause of ocean swells. Say you're a landlubber who is afraid of maritime journeys. Is it possible you might believe that seafaring storms result from Poseidon's anger at those sinful, promiscuous, and carousing foul-mouthed sailors? Do you think other community members might agree with you for any uncertified reason you present? How likely is it that your story transitions from folklore to becoming a wrongful truth based on a long tradition of cultural consensus? We typically fear what we don't understand. New and old nonfiction stories try to describe something meaningful in nature, generally based on subjective knowledge from the epoch men explained the happenings. But depending on the source and that source's history, the description of such events can be sensationalized while falling far short of objective reality. As such, it's not unusual that the real cause of an event, or series of events, is not fully known and gets lost in myths and faulty translations as the knowledge on specific subjects improves. Anachronistic colorful stories can persist well into future generations by purposely ignoring alternatives, being blinded to the academic antithesis, or out of simple credulity. Many people don't see the paradox of Christian misperceptions as a problem, becoming a silent crisis that is harder to isolate and correct in future times. Critical thinking methods and best practices have vastly enhanced civilization from experts in their specialized fields of study, unlike the ancient clerics' rhetoric and prophecies that are little better than mid-20th century weather forecasts. Anything other than the refined techniques of statistical research models is what I call a seamless affront to man's more urgent need for better ways of improving his knowledge. So, how does one explain inept influences, unsound thinking, and the plain nonsense of some broad imaginings? It has much to do with the profitable nature of alluring traditions, fear of reprisal, the general lack of knowledge, and the laws of the period. Or, for other reasons, it has not been widely dispelled at some earlier time in history. William of Ockham posited a solution that yields a most simple success in detecting the truth. As it has become known, Occam's razor is the principle that recommends a person should make as few compounded assumptions as possible when trying to explain any phenomenon. A pragmatic explanation will likely be the correct conclusion in producing the standard definition of truth. This heuristic is a simple yet straightforward beginning of the astute inquisitor's search for a broader understanding and applies equally to all past, present, and future generations. An early 14th century Franciscan, Occam tried to prove God's existence through reason alone. But his principle of simplicity would help explain natural events more so than any mysterious realm of the supernatural. Because of the most predisposed organizers of the world's churches and their followers' various ideologies of gods and foreboding prophets, I've had to speculate on the religious institutions' current aspirations outside the Bible's promise that the meek shall inherit the earth, not the fearmongers and capital rioters. I used Occam's razor while analyzing the Church's most probable religious-oriented aims. This abductive rationale was necessary to make sense of the Christian Church's political ambitions, now known, based on the Church-appointed, Republican-backed, alt-right Supreme Court inductees. This undemocratic minority is making the laws that countermand the majority's will. The Christian Church's unethical quest to devalue health standards is frightening and extremely dangerous. Because of the Church's protracted meddling with Republican lawmakers, the churches have also gained an undue array of privileges that have exceeded their restricted constitutional boundaries and special allowances they reap from American taxpayers. Science is not the be-all and end-all of knowledge. It's just the best means we have to discover the truth and what constitutes well-being. We contemplate but are often unprepared for the future storms that will recur throughout our lives. Suppose an inexperienced crew is not on board a sturdy ship heading directly into the storm waves. The dutiful sailors and their captains may not save the vessel or themselves from the ocean's torrents. The potential problems with insufficient knowledge will require a higher level of basic training, or the level of survivability will decrease accordingly. Likewise, stern measures will be necessary to correct a dysfunctional belief in a country's culture. Conservatively, a Gallup poll showed that over 100 million Americans think our planet is less than 10,000 years old. This is good news for the Church, but embarrassing news for our country's school system. The more discerning problems with man are not his uninformed claims or his misguided ideas, why certain things happen in nature, so much as the unsubstantiated information that gets haphazardly passed on to the next generation through a long tradition of hearsay. Do not all responsible and capable members of society owe their children the courtesy to demand that only demonstrable truths embody their public or private education? Moreover, I don't think we should condone disinformation or have the right to be wrong when access to better, more accurate information is readily available to technological societies. And who would want to be wrong on any subject matter or for any reason? To decipher information correctly, shouldn't kids be taught how to think for themselves rather than what to believe based on their guardians' ideologies? The Church would like nothing better than to dumb down the population. Jesus did not return when he said he would. Verily I say unto you, this generation shall not pass away till all these things are fulfilled. Matthew 24 verse 34. This verse refers to the generation some apostles were still alive. Probably around 70 ACE when Jerusalem fell to the Romans. But this story has been delineated and perpetuated afterward for millennia, ignoring the worst of human suffering and desperate pleas of the persecuted masses. Rather than a soon-to-be new world order and the resurrection of the dead as promised, we see endless religious conflicts and disdain for any opposition from the nonconformists, including religion's stubborn resistance to consider or adhere to the social contract of man's better wisdom. Believe it or not, the central issue dividing America is between Christian socialism and another idea called democratic social justice. The primary objective of a decent government is to protect its people, here and now, from physical harm and misinformation. We conduct this feat by exposing ignorance and fraud in all its shades of gray and in a way that strategically disincentivizes pseudoscience and antisocial behaviors. Careful attention to detail and integrity will be crucial in that work, even though the truth will likely hurt the volatile sentiments of the less open-minded community members. Unsurprisingly, these same community members often think of themselves as first-class sailors. Google the Dunning-Kruger effect to find out why. Immanuel Kant and John Stuart Mill's philosophies discuss the importance of unwavering honesty and the more significant benefits of the greatest number of a population. But one bit of caution to the ethics of Mill's consequentialism. One must respect each individual's right to life, liberty, and pursuit of justice. For example, taking a passive or non-active role in life-threatening situations could be appropriate compared to its antithesis, deciding who lives or dies and in what number. Hence, utilitarianism has become a controversial moral dilemma. Check out the trolley problem online. My later analyses will look more deeply into the Bible's type of morality, some good and some bad, and a secular civilization's idea of basic human good focused on universal well-being. Sometimes generous acts are deceptions, however. A psychopath or thief can display charisma and feign innocence to achieve their goal, which could be dangerous for both perpetrator and victim. For example, take the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. While in public, he appeared outwardly to be ordinary, even charming, but we know that was a deception, and him being disingenuous when some of his secretive behaviors became known. Protecting oneself while holding others to ethical standards of good conduct is responsible behavior of a public citizen. From a Stoic's perspective, I'm often skeptical of what might be behind the good acts people perform and the loving things they say. Are their acts plain kindness or something more akin to the adage, there are no free lunches? I want to know what ulterior motives someone might have or the level of reciprocity they expect in return for their gifts. I don't particularly appreciate being deceived or lied to, regardless of what personal resolve guides that person's good intentions. I am more interested in whether a person's words are consistent with their actions and what might lie behind their motives. By the current tragic events that have transpired in the halls of America's citadel, it's clear that the positive changes many yearn for are being looked into, however slow and harrowing that task may be for the Biden administration. Thankfully, Democrats have a couple of years, without overwhelming Republican obstructionism, to assess the damage inflicted by Mitch McConnell's misuse of power to support the 45th president's crime spree. His actions and inactions financially benefited Mitch and his associates' wealth, including the Christian churches and other large corporations buying Republicans, right and left. Still, we Americans have another hill to climb before becoming a united beacon of humanity, instead of a sick country plagued by pre-Renaissance hypocrites. Installing representatives with ethical integrity and better educating the public would be an excellent start to overseeing meaningful reforms in American politics. Voters should support those who will submit to a critical knowledge test and significantly commit their support to the majority they represent, especially in Black communities that receive 3/5 of a vote through GOP gerrymandering. I don't see that anything other than comprehensive government reforms will improve our situation amid all of America's critical challenges. I have also concluded we must create a stronger union among the vast majority of humanists that support the separation of the people's religious faiths and the secular functions of the state in line with the Constitution. And challenging the grifting elite, like other isolated problems, will require well-coordinated grassroots efforts. Those most adversely affected by others' indifference are the majority who hold power over the few calling the shots. The people will rule if that more significant majority of ordinary people can figure out how to unite their collective power. And let's be clear, swearing an oath to the American Constitution with your hand on the Bible is oxymoronic if that sacred book is in opposition to the Constitution. The first of the 10 Commandments does just that. It says, "Thou shalt have no other gods before thee." This exclusive Christian religion rules out all others' freedom to their own beliefs and gods. Furthermore, superstition and spectral evidence have no legitimate place in a court of law. To learn why, read The Crucible by Arthur Miller. If the offenders of decency are not held accountable for their indiscretion, those demeaning practices will become normalized in their apparent contradictions. In the same vein, offering free get-out-of-jail cards or stating something as a fact without sufficient evidence is reprehensible, if not counterproductive. We, as a people, should focus on humane types of rehabilitation, supercharging the public education system, and planning our earthly future in the plausible reality that no superheroes will be helping us amend our blunders. Prayers will not replace actions, nor will agnostic complacency. The Bible says in James 2 verse 26, "Faith without works is dead." I contend that law and order are dead without equality and accountability, which does not include receiving a blanket pardon if you faithfully executed the biddings of your dear leader. Another significant problem in America is the freedom to thwart unbiased historical knowledge to protect one's faith. Suppose that kind of deception causes subtle but long-term harmful effects on kids and the larger public due to its irresponsible misleading intent. It must then be adjudicated among the deceived societal members before it is justified in the name of one's freedom or normalized for the next generation of fools to embrace and spread to their children. And who's responsible for the Church's continued secretive financial operations among better, more effective, transparent systems? I suggest that responsibility lands on the decent people that don't know how to effectively address the crisis or those who haven't mustered the courage to help mitigate the problems caused by the Christian institution and their government enablers on both sides of the aisle. On all fronts of the grassroots movement, action is how we will start balancing the playing field with a country's often unsuspecting or unscrupulous players. The unengaged don't want to cause waves, so they fail to punish the corporations and organizations, enabling political and religious offenders to continue their often insidious influences on the public. Calling out the bad actors will ultimately require a vastly better educated and united multitude. But to realize the power one person has to push back against injustice, read the history of migrant activist Cesar Chavez. He is a notable exception. Suppose Christianity is allowed to run rampant, armed with its well-funded, powerfully persuasive sophistry and the enormous wealth of its corporate friends. Does the average person stand a chance to keep a balance of power against the dark money proponents if their elected officials don't do that work? If you take an approach like that of Cesar Chavez, the answer is yes. As a result of widespread deceptions, lies, and blatant corruption in the Republican Party, the American experiment has returned to the stage of a hypothesis. Left to its spiritual infirmity, the United States of America will remain an ineffective wish until bold secular truths are spoken tactfully yet openly among all political parties. Through scientific research, America has shown its potential by negotiating big ideas and making bold changes in the past. But the Church still maintains control over the resolutions of politicians even though representatives have direct access to the National Academy of Sciences. But would rather listen to disinformation spewed from the pulpits. As mind-boggling as this is, the intense divisions among religious sects show how inconsistent the Bible's interpretations can be and how unethical are their meddling antics. Bear with me as I work to confirm the validity of these statements. It's time to hold the churches accountable, especially since this institution lacks any present-day documented evidence of its actual effectiveness due to its covert fiscal operations. The Church's finances, in toto, should be as transparently reported as is their absentee God Yahweh. Churches owe it to the people to not just superficially display their good intentions, but undeniably prove their legitimacy and viability, or get out of the business of milking the IRS and telling people what they believe, as printed on the country's money. However, holding this cash cow to any accountability would be like extracting an impacted molar with a toothpick. Well-monitored restrictions must apply to institutions that mislead the public by rejecting man's more remarkable progress toward health and confirmational knowledge. Do we want to take the chance of relapsing into another dark age of church-led dogma? Could this be the slow barge floating us all out to sea and into another violent storm? Read about the Spanish Inquisition. To correct human civilization efficiently and promptly, we must devote our efforts to evidence-based practices, not unrealistic expectations of men formulated through superstitions. Preaching unproven doctrine from the authoritarian podium is comparable to misleading sophistry or false advertising, furthering the misperceptions of its parishioners, or, more accurately, their valued customers. Whatever will be the demise of America moving forward, it won't be from reasonable skeptics. It will come from those manipulated or groomed during the vulnerable times in their lives who still have not shaken off the nonsense of ancient rites. This constitutionally protected Bible doctrine of privilege and mysticism will, all on its own, lead America to an unhoped-for end before it ends itself. And as the rational segment of the population can perceive, specious traditions from distant ages tend to go unchallenged and remain a seemingly harmless activity through their long-standing and non-stop repetitive teachings to the young and gullible. These continued subcultural indoctrination rituals of superstition are symptomatic of America's indignant Christian public bullying. Other shadowy forms of influence over people's emotions extend equally to other religions and authority claims. But these salacious beliefs have the same predictable effects as they have had for thousands of years, reinforcing one's inept knowledge and fanciful prescience. This big divide between scientism and Christianism must yield to the most truthfully profound strategy for humankind. But whom should be granted that charge? Those who know most facts and speak from a verifiable truth, or those acting on emotional intuitions based on a tradition that offers no proofs at all? 2 Timothy 4 verse 5 commands the Church to make full proof of thy ministry. But an honest person knows that's impossible, thus, relying on faith is the only alternative to the absence of evidence. Regarding church-connected political intrigue, look no further than the alt-right Republican Party. They would be hard-pressed to go a day without lying, cheating, and stealing to achieve their vision of faithism partnered with Machiavellianism. And as we've seen with the wild religious followers of the Trumpian cult, these ideologies spell trouble for America and the need to remove or replace the words "in God we trust" back to its original rendering of e pluribus unum, Latin for out of many, one. So, what else can we do to counter the Church's insidious practice of coveting the wealth of the elderly and converting children to the adult version of Santa and a grumpy old Grinch? Who dares think clamping chains on the Church could mean our salvation from tyranny? Section 3. Man created God in his image, intolerant, sexist, homophobic, and violent. George Weinberg. If there is a benevolent God, the ancient scribes got his inspired narrative masterfully wrong in their writings. We find inconsistent representations of its almighty leader in the biblical scriptures. For example, the Old Testament, in particular, tells of a jealous, vindictive, and angry God of the Abrahamic religions. This God can display loving kindness and mercy so long as you obey his presumptuous injunctions and unkind threats, "Do as I say, not as I do." These unsophisticated traits of a deity describe a typical human persona, not an all-powerful, loving God that should be all-understanding and forever nonpartisan. And when it comes to long-standing religious conflicts and resentment, the naive people of the time are reflected in their God's human-like mentality and boastful character so harshly described in the so-called Holy Scriptures. This often intimidating Christian authority figure declares that he must launch an apocalypse on his disobedient children who don't pledge allegiance to his Savior's Son. Jesus says in John 14 verse 6, "No man cometh unto the Father, but by me." According to this Bible verse, one must accept Christ's redemption and resurrection to avoid committing the one and only unforgivable sin, blasphemy against the Holy Ghost. What's more, because this God created a man and woman who sinned by eating an apple from the forbidden tree of knowledge, you must accept his resolution to this problem: make every man suffer a wicked curse after that seemingly innocuous transgression. On what infamous grounds should one suffer vicariously? Why did he lead the first couple into temptation and not deliver them from evil? Is not the watchmaker responsible for the artisanship of the watch? Why wasn't Mother Nature blamed for these Homo sapiens' inherent conduct and issued legitimate pardons? So, after this Heavenly Father's first wave of earthly destruction, Armageddon, this all-powerful, loving Father figure will allow his arch-rival to torture the non-believers for eternity. Wouldn't that be considered losing much of the battle to your enemy? So then, unless you accept his ultimatum, believe in my Son as your Redeemer, or the worst possible punishment ever imagined will be your fate, and you don't want that, do you? He's not just a threatening God with conflicting interests, but a God that certainly does not deserve any praise by today's standards. His forgiveness is a limited offer. He proved that when his power to forgive did not apply to Adam and Eve. The Bible's most significant revelation is the return of Jesus, which his followers have always expected would happen soon. However, soon means just any old time after Christ's death, which keeps changing with each Christian apologist from every generation and epoch of wars and rumors of wars. This Bible prediction could hardly be more ambiguous. But at a mysterious secret time that no one knows, Jesus and his followers will joyously and forever bring about the end of wickedness after 2,000 years of anticipation. But I think it will take a bit of white evil for those clothed in bright shiny robes to achieve this final solution to inherited sin. Ironically, in an attempt to prove this supernatural retribution projected for humankind, the followers must create it, like the ancient men of earth created the God purported to have said these things. This is the stuff of fiction, a Hollywood blockbuster, a Greek tragedy, or a Shakespearean play minus the comedy. To think there might be a draconian leader of our grand universe is mind-boggling for those who don't adhere to these Old and New Testament legends or modern-day conspiracy theories. It's no more than a self-fulfilling prophecy of Gothic repercussions. On the opposite spectrum, I'll mention one example not in the Bible. Genuine love is unconditional. I will assume most people understand this highest aspect of love in becoming an authentic flesh and blood person. In all fairness, the Bible infers that love is not self-seeking. But if this is true, shouldn't God exemplify that behavior by not accepting praise? And shouldn't that standard apply to a meta-entity that created the universe, if one of these all-powerful, perfectly benevolent deities exists? For argument's sake, assume there is a miraculous God. My position is as sure as the ancients coined the sunrise. If this God is not perversely twisted, there is no fiery afterlife for the non-believers in Jesus, nor is there a non-corporeal Heavenly Father figure and his defiant archenemy Lucifer, as they are depicted in the Bible. It merely explains the ancient tendency to assign a supernatural agency to man's naturally profound imagination, and this makes sense only in consideration that scientific discourse was unavailable or unsupported when these ideas were developed and spread among the commoners. As I have alluded to, if there is a modern-day apocalypse on Earth by a rare astronomical event, it will not be one from the prophetic books of Daniel or Revelations, or the angry God of creation. Instead, it will be of random natural causes incited by the religious fanatics who believe their God is real and his words unassailable. Who could, in deference to such a God, lower themselves in light of his inconsistent practice of unassuaged punishments? I will, in future articles, produce scriptural evidence of the hideous curses proposed for those who don't acknowledge the Christian God's supernatural nepotism and dictatorship or give generously to the Church. The core of religious faith is bizarre, including their age-old ceremonial practices, its orthodoxy's differentiated number, and the disgusting claims that Democrats are led by an evil cabal of cannibalistic blood-drinking pedophiles. This blasphemy is untrue. It's the Republicans that are led by the Catholic Church. But seriously, these absurdities are taken directly out of the Old Testament and spread by QAnon types of religious groups that harbor vicious vendettas. The Christian faith unknowingly or willingly spread the misinformation that helps believers sanction wild, rebellious behaviors and the dishonorable actions of their supposed God-appointed leaders. In the wake of January 6th, the Church must bear responsibility for the brazen madness displayed by its Christian mob. The Church did not jump at the chance to officially condemn its fanatical Christian followers that tried to overturn the 2020 election. But they had little apprehension in promptly denouncing Putin's war to overthrow the Ukrainian government. On top of all this, the Church's enablers and high government positions receive massive campaign funding from the Church's deep pockets of unregulated tax-free dark money. Moreover, in what seems to be a desperate last-ditch effort to force their religion on the whole population, they have organized again to homegrown acts of sedition. And throughout a long, well-orchestrated offensive, the most influential churches have attempted to overthrow the last vestiges of a secular American government by weaponizing the courts and supporting anarchy, not to mention snubbing the medical profession. They are slowly taking over other public and private businesses to enrich themselves other than just hospitals. If not called out for who they are and what they're doing, this indignant institution will likely expand its seditious influence and suppress all who don't submit to their self-proclaimed right to make and enforce their own rules as a sovereign entity. Could this be the reason we don't have universal health care? Are they making too much money to change how hospitals operate today? The January 6th Commission's efforts will not be complete until they also investigate the Church's involvement in supporting a national religion through government agencies. I hope I'm not the only one who realizes this connection as a significant problem among America's highly influential dark money organizations partnered with big corporations. For all to see with their own eyes, it has exposed the lengths to which racist fanatics and other government leaders are willing to go to preserve their private practices and autocratic aspirations of white supremacy. Even black evangelicals unwittingly support this white man's hypocrisy by not condemning slavery practiced and condoned in the scriptures. Start critically reading Exodus 21. Sooner or later, we must break the taboo assigned to questioning church authority, and the clergy needs to stop making excuses for the not-so-good book and its God's flagrant atrocities described throughout the Bible. Since the Church lost its power to enslave the body, people's minds are all they have left except for women's bodily rights. 1 Corinthians 7 verse 4 says, "The wife hath not power of her own body." I wonder if aspiring doctors should be taught this Bible verse in medical school. In all of the Church's history, they do whatever is possible to maintain power over its subjects. This corruption includes blocking or breaking the black man's will and banning books with unsavory historical accounts of past Christian activities. Unbalanced Christians are famous for projecting their faults on others, not in their religious fold. And who knows how many of its leaders have pedophilic inclinations and act on those urges. Hardline believers rarely seek alternative explanations outside of their extraordinary claims of the supernatural. Their adamant refusal or inability to reason within logical constraints often devalues the strides made by hardworking disciplined educators, scientists, and medical professionals. Today, the consequences of this kind of religious short-sightedness have become insulting and a persistent obstruction to human civilization. One example is crediting God for saving a life instead of those with the courage or skill to make it happen. In all its pockets of fantasy, misinformation, varied teachings, and insatiable quest for power and privilege, these institutional traits of religion are nothing new. What is new are the increasing medical advancements that supersede prayers and the Church's long-standing empire of truth by proclamation. This should expose their constitutionally protected set of wrongful claims and old mistakes, but surprisingly, in a hardened number of its congregations, it doesn't. One of the reasons the Church promotes what they say are real miracles is to help them defend the illusion of their God's existence. These miraculous claims are unverifiable and easy to protect by constructing a low bar for acceptable evidence. However, extraordinary claims must comport with overwhelming and undeniable evidence, or they can gain no more credibility than everyday anecdotes to the more insightful, educated thinkers. Besides the Church's ill-begotten wealth and corporate assistance, wishes of immortality in a heavenly existence, the anticipated joy of family reunions with the dearly departed, and the fear of possibly going to hell are the only things that keep these fabulous stories alive in people's minds. The Church has monopolized selling the best and worst things a person can hopefully or regrettably imagine. The relentless scientific advancements vastly changing our world have made media companies a powerful tool to spread Christian dogma and conspiracy theorists' pseudoscience. But other social media outlets or a simple internet search makes fact-checking conservative news stations and their talk shows propaganda easy to debunk, if you are a balanced critical-minded thinker and dig deep enough. In 1907, the Catholic Church officially named modernism a pervasive threat to their future sovereignty. Liberal arts and the natural sciences are also disproving the Church's doctrine. They're fully aware of this academic knowledge's threat to their specious ideals. But unable to effectively counter this sinister menace of modern human progress, the Church has had to consent to some suspiciously liberal notions that don't align with its more strict traditional teachings. But their meek and mild demeanor changes once they gained substantial power. Its draconian side shines through with fury, rearing its ugly head, and all it consumes one generation after the next with no end in sight, only faint but legitimate opposition from the nuns, non-affiliated theists. The Church clerics and rogue Republicans are finding it increasingly difficult to counteract their impending doom in this new age of awareness and a growing number of more competent, self-reliant thinkers. An intellectually or emotionally mature person will recognize that our everyday social influences, that inform our thoughts and behaviors, don't always align with the known facts of life. So, it's as good a time as any other to deal with innovations and discoveries without invoking any supernatural thoughts on the issues. The traditional practices of the Church have been the reason for slow progress in man's history, his potential health and happiness throughout the years, and the dividing force that counters a country's much-needed protection in areas like a doctor-patient privilege, based on the best available evidence. This religious adversary of nature's reality remains demeaning to rational women and men and their communities. Man is outgrowing his religion, but still needs a helping hand to reject it outright. Still, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Protestant denominations lazily working part-time jobs to procure your money. Despite this internal discrepancy in their doctrinal interpretations, they further the indeterminate God concept by making the Bible say whatever you want it to mean. Right or wrong, not all institutional traditions from ages past represent mainstream religion in America. They are instead the offshoots of the more behaved religious practices of the Christians. They include a growing succession of rogue churches and 21st-century alt-right groups, sects, and cultish affiliations that condone racism, hatred, and violent chaos. These internal conflicts deepen divisions among Christian denominations and cause substantial antipathy among non-Christian faiths, further intensifying the great divide between people's convictions and the secular values of non-believers. Belief in demons and angels exacerbates people's psychological disorders, as do some illicit drugs. It also misinforms people and diverts them from embracing their evolution from a last universal common ancestor and focusing much-needed attention on a responsible social order committed to preserving our sanity and other natural resources. Facts don't care how you feel, what you hope for, or whether you have faith or petition your God. But to continue your maturation, one must be open to seeing the alternatives, confronting their firmly held incomplete knowledge to overcome deception. Beliefs based on insufficient data and emotions, like faith, are unreliable means to the truth. Do not other religions rely on faith? Does that make their religion right or proper? It's time for decent people to openly express their disgust with Republican politics and stay engaged in making the significant changes necessary to preserve the critical functions of government and the courts, not a highly irresponsible artificial theocracy. We desperately need more effective government representatives to go beyond our lowest expectations. I'm referring to the Republican enablers of America's most openly corrupt president, Donald Trump. Responsible public leaders and influential private sector members who care about preserving and enhancing life must soon join a yet-to-be-founded national secular voting bloc. The nones, those of no religious preference, are now one of the fastest-growing demographics in America over the past decade. This is undoubtedly an encouraging trend. As an American, I demand freedom from the constitutionally protected beliefs of the Church operating in the people's government. The radical ties to other abhorrent cults and their questionable practices have no place in politics unless an overwhelming comprehensive array of restrictions apply. Organizing rational, secular skeptics under one umbrella is my idea of a thoughtfully righteous undertaking for any intelligent civilization that values truth and honesty. But for far too long, the massive number of fabricated views of God's loving concern based on superstition has held back the work necessary to overcome the adversities confronting all humanity's vital interests and best long-term prospects. If church practices undermine the majority's will, someone must hold them responsible or tighten the noose on their power. We cannot let the fox and its friends, dressed in sheep's clothing, guard the henhouse of politics and public opinion. Allowing the church to operate unconstrained means its followers will continue to distort science facts and sell bogus nonsense as truth, the opposite of what the church portrays as its mission and moral character. Enforcing a proper interpretation of the Constitution will stop the Church's infiltration into the people's government. This should be every rational citizen's primary objective as we correct our path forward. Despite the ongoing chaos here and abroad, we should all protect the vote and not give up hope for a safe and productive future for our children, even with disillusioned Christian fanatics making decisions for us all. The dream of an undivided government is impossible in a church-sanctioned Christian nationalism. If the church and its enablers stay undeterred, their takeover could become a more dangerous and destructive reality for Americans. I'm sorry to say that supporting this religious institution makes you guilty of everything acceptable and unacceptable in the Bible scriptures. If God is timeless, wouldn't you think his past mandates should always be the law? Or does his morality improve through time as man changes for the good? If the latter is true, his moral character is progressively relative. A healthy society begins with a child's life at home, with well-rounded guardians who understand the need to remain agnostic in religious matters and who will promote a fully vetted, evidence-based education system. Never the Church's instruction from an authority figure of mystic proportions, or to prepare for an unsubstantiated immortal afterlife. Only then will we have a larger, more talented pool of legislators to choose from in our elections. Those we might trust to stand for our best interests here and now, and the ones more likely to adorn our future. But I must admit, anything would be better than the current assemblage of greedy or religious sycophants presently supporting the divided states of America. And anyone rejecting the much-needed control over the rogue factions and their supporters' willingness to lie, cheat, and steal from their government offices are the prominent adversaries of the American experiment. In a savior God's old mandates and his corrupt corporate supporters, the Church and its political cronies stand for the institution of subversion. It's clear, old lies, old ways of cheating, and old stealing tactics are the current Republican policies for America, or, should I say, a long-repeated abomination orchestrated by the more powerful churches and the unscrupulous indifference associated with excessive greed. Man's last best hope is the sustainable unity of a science-literate nation. We have much to be thankful for in the wake of scientific progress and its ability to sink the tugboat of Republicans' public lies. Outside of that, there's not much worth mentioning but a few cherry-picked parts of the Bible. The question on the minds of atheists goes something like this: will Americans ever clamber on board a clear-cut, unsinkable ship heading into calmer waters for everyone's future well-being? I, for one, sincerely hope so in my efforts towards this universal humanitarian cause. The end of sections 1 to 3. Parts 4 through 6 will continue in the following essay series.